his book. I can refer to that if somebody wants and double check. In any case, I believe that I had read that when you oxygenate to 15 parts per million prior to your pitch, that within 2 hours of time, every bit of the oxygenation that you had dissolved in suspension has been taken up by the yeast cells that were in there. And so what that means then is that all of the daughter cells that would come along, and I've yet to know for sure how often they reproduce in a mead must. I know I once knew how long it took for bread yeast to reproduce making bread, and then I also at one point thought I knew what it was in a mead must. Now in a beer environment, but in any case, that's why we want to wait until there's some reproduction that has gone on, rather than giving them more oxygen later and then forgetting about the daughter cells later down the road. I think it's at least to some degree normal for wine people to oxygenate at pitch and then at 24 hours. And I think in Chris White's book he spoke of doing it at like between 12 and 15 hours. And so I actually myself do it at those 3 different times along the time frame.
And with the cell counts, you could do cell counts, looking under the microscope with a hemocytometer. You could extrapolate from that and figure out how. I do have a hemocytometer. I haven't used it for a while.
I knew it.
I was going to say, I have 3 of those laying around in the basement. I just never use them.
Yeah, I have it. It's just I have to get the dust off of it. But yeah, we are nerds, aren't we?
And better than that, nerds with equipment.
If anyone would have that, Tom, it would be you, my friend.
Well, I'm gonna buy a stir plate, and I'm gonna hand it off to my husband, the automation engineer, and see if he can create something for me.
One thing to drop back a little bit, your stir plate comment was a perfect segue to this. To iterate what we spoke of last week, you can only get maximum of 8 parts per million when you use our Earth's atmospheric conditions to try to give our yeast the parts per million that they really like. And in Chris White's book, he speaks of high-gravity beer worts, and of course all of us know that most of the mead that we make are even beyond, quote, a high-gravity beer wort. He says that the yeast do best with between 12 and 15 parts per million. And so I just want to remind all of our listeners that if you're doing something, i.e. a fish pump or a lee stir or just shaking the crap out of your carboys, at the very best you're only going to get 8 parts per million. And Chris says that our yeast would really like to have 12 or to 15 parts per million. And so really the only way you're ever going to get that is if you buy some pure oxygen and a centered stone and do it that way.
Joe Abruzzo has a add-on to this. Would it be more often if you don't have a stone? I'm guessing he's saying like an aquarium stone like we used to use.
If you're doing it with a whisk, like I do, you probably do want to do it more often. Because if you're not as effective, you want to do it more often.
I love my one on my drill, the stick on the drill with the fold-out paddles, and it's great. And you just gotta be really careful if you're in a carboy. You can bust a carboy in about 2 seconds flat with one of those things.
I'm always curious. I'm really not as much of a science guy as some people might think, but I do happen to know very intimately some elite things in some different practices that I'm involved in. And in this other said thing that I really have a huge heart for, I have found that sometimes what seems common sense actually doesn't hold truth when the truth be told. And so I want to run this question to Tom, hoping maybe that he would know. Tom, is there a difference between feeding our yeast 8 parts per million through atmospheric conditions versus being able to give them 12 to 15 with help with our pure oxygen?
Well, there isn't a way to get really above that 8 parts per million. So, some oxygen is better than nothing. And if you're trying to do it by stirring, you're also degassing a little bit and putting the yeast into suspension, which is good. Mm-hmm. But it's still not going to have the same effect for the yeast as using pure oxygen. Now, a lot of the commercial folks don't have access to that either, and they do a pump over, which is, they pump it over and try to get some oxygen from the air, and so that is good, but it's still not going to be the same or as much as just using a stainless steel stone. And it's not going to take you as much time either. I mean, I put my stone on there, and and I move it around, and it does stir up some of the yeast and particles also.
Yeah.
But you cannot get the same amount other than using direct oxygen in that way.
And I think about all the years
does the yeast... I'm sorry, go ahead, Vicki.
I was just going to say, I think about all the years that the way we oxygenated was to shake the crap out of the bucket. Take the the airlock off and plug the hole in the top and just shake the shit out of it.
Oh yeah.
Well, the problem with that though is you're stuck with whatever happens to be in the carboy. All you're incorporating is whatever's in the carboy, and if it's producing carbon dioxide, it's mostly carbon dioxide you're mixing back in.
Exactly. We didn't know that then, or we didn't. Nobody was talking about it anyway.
Even if you have an open bucket and you're stirring it, there's going to actually be a blanket of CO2 on top, and you're going to blow some of the air down onto the surface. But I think it's been shown that just stirring it is not going to be as much oxygen as putting it in there with putting pure O2 in there with a stone.
But bottom line, I think anything's better than nothing.
Absolutely, for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I don't know, when I use my stir
that's the same thing with nutrient additions too.
Yeah, go ahead.
People argue, what do they prefer, Firmo, Firm K, DAP, how often, every 12 hours, getting it in there and staggering it, and don't put the DAP up front, obviously, because that's toxic to yeast, but as long as you're using something and you're putting it in a staggered amount, that's going to be better than not using anything at all, or using raisins or whatever.
I was hoping you wouldn't say that.
I had to say it.
You lost $1, Tom.
I had to say it. I almost didn't, but I'm like, I'm going to say it.
Are there more
John
questions?
Torkington's listening, we just lost a listener.
Pissed him off. No, that was the last. That was the last of the leftover questions. So you can get on.
All right.
You can get on with sulfiting now.
Just before we do, I've been travelling around the country a little bit for work lately, and I just wanted to give a shout out to Daniel Ivey, who caught up with me for dinner the other night and gave me a lovely bottle of he's calling it caramelized honey mead, so I guess it's just a Bochet. It's a very dark sort of oxidized colour, which you'd expect from Bochet, but it's quite a lovely little drop. Also, welcome to Colin Brannigan from Townsville area, who is listening today. Good to meet you the other day. And last but not least, I visited Thistle. Well, not Thistle itself. I went out to dinner with the owners of Thistle Meadery, and they have a new bourbon barrel mead on that they've just bottled, which I have a bottle of here that I'm just itching to taste. But right now I'm drinking that Bochet from Daniel Ivey. So cheers, mate. Thank you very much. Now on to the other stuff.
Now on to sulfiting.
So I'm really happy that we have Tom with us tonight. As we've talked about many times in the past, there's so much misinformation on the social platforms these days, and of course everybody can become an expert within just a few short hours of any topic under the sun, thanks to YouTube and Facebook. But what we really come to find out once we're more than just a dilettante in this thing is that there's a tremendous amount of misinformation or only partial information. And so, folks, we're really proud and pleased to have Tom on here with us this evening. And we're going to go through a process where you can learn everything that you need to know to be able to actually take care of your meads in a fashion that will, in my opinion, be worthy of the time, the money, the investment, and all that we put into our batches. I feel like so often when people choose to not go this route, I think that if they really understood what they were opting to opt out on and realized the benefits that they gain by doing this, particularly in the long-term aspect of things, it really comes down to me feeling like if people understood this more, I believe that all of us would realize the cheap insurance that we provide by doing these things with our mead. And so with that, I'm going to hand this over to Tom.
Well, thank you, Ryan. Yeah, sulfites. They instill some pretty strong and passionate opinions in people. What they do and whether they're bad or not. It's it's one thing when you talk to people about their food and dietary and beverage choices. It's almost maybe not quite a strong opinion as if you talk politics or religion. It's some people just really feel pretty strongly about that. And I have to admit, in the early days when I first started making mead, I didn't want to use sulfites either. I didn't want to put any of those chemicals in my mead. And I thought, I'm not going to drink it. I don't want to. I'm not going to age it. I'll just drink it. And I had some stuff that was actually, at the time I thought it was reasonably good. It probably wasn't as good as I thought, but I put it away and I opened it up a year later and it had gone bad, and it was just really sad. And that's when I started learning about sulfites a little bit more and how to use them properly. And then later, when I started auditing some enology or winemaking courses, I learned even more about the importance of them. And then later, when I started actually testing in mead, and I really realized how much of what I was doing by guessing, I was either under-sulfiting most of the time or very rarely over-sulfiting. And getting that figured out and how to use sulfites properly, but not too much, and how to use them to preserve the freshness of your mead, it's really been one of the things I think it's allowed me to win a lot of medals, more than I would have won had I not been doing it or not been doing it correctly. So I thought about this a lot over the past few days. I actually wrote up like a Q&A just so I wouldn't forget about anything that we might want to talk about. And it's not ready for sharing with others because I have a lot of editing, but I hope to get it written up and finished, and then maybe we can post it as like a file on our forum. It's basically just questions about sulfites. So sulfites have actually been around for a long time. I think it was the Romans that first reported using them to preserve wine in barrels. And sulfur is a mineral, and it can be found typically around volcanoes, and so it's a yellow mineral. And the sulfur dioxide, which is the sulfites we talk about, or abbreviated as SO2, is what we use to put into wine or into mead. But it's really used in a lot of different food products to maintain freshness and color. And some foods, like dried fruit, has an unbelievable amount of sulfites in them, like many, many times, 10 times, 100 times more than in wine or in mead. And the other thing, too, is, I've on the forums or whatnot, people say, well, I don't want to put anything that doesn't belong in there naturally. Well, there's actually sulfites produced by the yeast through fermentation. And I think in wine it's normally around 10 to 40 parts per million, but I think I read one study where there was one that was like even 70 parts per million, this one red wine in France that had really high amount. I mean, that's as much as you'd need. I mean, you would need to add any. When I test my own meads, the baseline that I find before I've added a sulfite is usually around 5 or 15 parts per million. And so when I'm sulfiting, I might only be trying to aim for 25 or 30, maybe a little more if it's a sweet mead. So I'm not adding a huge amount, compared to what some of the regulations allow, which I can't remember. I think in the United States it's around 300 if you're a commercial, which 350. I just looked it up, and the EU is like 210 for white wine and 160 for red wine, which is a crazy high value, much more than you need. But a lot of folks are like, well, I don't want to use sulfites because I can't drink red wine because that's what gives me a headache. And it's true, red wine does give people headache, especially if you drink too much of it. But it's actually not